During the Second World War, soldiers had to fight not only against the enemy, but also against merciless nature itself. The brutal winter became an invisible opponent, attacking day and night. Frost seeped through uniforms, weapons froze, and bodies suffered from frostbite. And what was even worse, hungry stomachs had to fight for every single calorie. It's often said that an army marches on its stomach, and in freezing conditions, that truth doubled in meaning. In this video, you'll discover what soldiers ate during extreme cold in World War II, how they managed to prepare hot meals in the midst of snowstorms, what desperate improvisations hunger forced upon them, and which surprising foods kept them alive. Soon, we'll reveal astonishing stories from the Eastern Front, but also inspiring moments of humanity. Soldiers sharing their last piece of bread, or brave cooks serving hot soup under enemy fire. Prepare for a journey through the frozen hell of the battlefields, where every bite could decide the difference between life and death. When people mention General Frost, many remember Napoleon's army's fate near Moscow in 1812. Hitler, at first, underestimated that lesson of history. He believed he would finish the war before the Russian winter struck. But the ruthless cold chose no sides. It struck all who fought. Before we reach the Eastern Front, let's look back at the first encounter of modern armies with extreme cold, the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union, 1939–1940. It was there that hunger and frost first proved capable of breaking even the strongest army. During the Winter War, the cold revealed itself as a killer. Soviet soldiers, many from southern regions, were unprepared for Arctic conditions. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees Celsius, snow buried the roads, and the human body in such cold burns far more calories just to maintain its basic temperature. When a soldier didn't receive enough food, he weakened quickly. Such was the case for many young Soviet troops lost in the forests of Karelia. Frontline supply collapsed. Long columns of trucks carrying provisions got stuck in snowdrifts, or were ambushed by Finnish ski patrols. For surrounded Soviet units, known as Mati, small pockets cut off from the main forces, survival was as hard as combat itself. Many froze with rifles in their hands. Others starved. According to Finnish reports, in some encircled Red Army camps, desperate soldiers slaughtered their last draft horses to cook horse meat, just to have something to eat. Those who survived later recalled that the worst enemy wasn't enemy fire. It was the endless winter and the empty stomach. Finnish soldiers, however, were in a much better position. Not because they lived in luxury, but because they were accustomed to harsh conditions and had the home field advantage. They knew the tricks of survival in freezing weather. Their diet was simple but hearty: rye bread, dried fish or salted meat, and hot porridge made of oats or barley cooked in field kettles. Many Finnish soldiers carried a piece of lard or bacon in their pockets. Fatty food provided energy and, unlike water, didn't freeze solid, so it could be bitten even when frozen. They also drank a hot beverage that resembled coffee, though there were no real coffee beans. Finns brewed a coffee substitute made of rye or chicory. It smelled terrible and tasted even worse, but it was hot, and it gave comfort. Soldiers often brewed it in small thermoses or mess tins over a fire, whenever they had a quiet moment. But not always was there time or safety to make a hot meal. Field kitchens had to operate discreetly. Even a faint wisp of smoke could mean death. Finnish snipers and saboteurs lay in wait for Soviet troops who tried to light fires. One Soviet political officer's diary told of his men being ruthlessly punished when they made fires to warm up and cook food. Finnish marksmen, hidden in trees, opened fire and scattered every campfire. On white snow, the dark silhouettes of men were easy targets. Imagine that situation. You are a frozen red army soldier. Your stomach growls. Your porridge in the mess tin has turned to ice. Finally, you risk lighting a few twigs. The flame licks the pot. Then bullets whistle around you. You have no choice but to extinguish the fire and eat cold food, or nothing at all. Such was the cruel dilemma of countless soldiers during the winter of 1939 to 40. The Finns used the frost to their advantage. Their ski units launched swift raids, attacked, delayed the enemy for a few hours, then vanished back into the dark forests. After such operations, Finnish troops retreated to prepared log shelters or dugouts where warmth, food, and even saunas awaited them. Yes, on the Finnish front, there were field saunas where soldiers could wash, warm up, and regain their strength. A sauna and a hot meal worked miracles for morale. Finnish veterans later said that 4 hours of rest on a bunk with a bowl of hot soup could restore a man's spirit completely. In contrast, surrounded Soviet soldiers spent freezing nights in makeshift trenches, often in wet clothing and with no real food. It's no wonder that losses from cold and exhaustion were enormous. The Winter War made it painfully clear that a lack of food in winter kills as surely as bullets. Historians note that thousands of Soviet soldiers died from hypothermia and starvation before a single Finnish bullet ever reached them. Although the Finns were eventually forced to sign peace and cede territory, morally they emerged victorious. A small nation standing against a giant army through determination, knowledge of the land, and because their soldiers did not starve. In this video, you'll soon learn how Hitler failed to apply the lessons of the harsh Finnish winter when just a year later, he sent his soldiers into an even greater cold on the Eastern Front. It was December 1941. The German Wehrmacht had pushed deep into Soviet territory as part of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's armies had already conquered vast areas, but Moscow still resisted. And then it came. General Frost struck with full force. By late 1941 and early 1942, temperatures dropped to 30 degrees Celsius. Winds whipped across the frozen ground, and snow fell endlessly from the sky. The Germans, dressed in light summer uniforms designed for a quick blitzkrieg, suddenly faced the same nightmare that had once destroyed Napoleon's army in 1812. Field Marshal von Bock reportedly wrote in his diary on November 30, 1941, "The frost grows stronger. No winter equipment has arrived. The food situation is worsening." While the Soviet defenders of Moscow were receiving padded jackets and felt boots, Valenki, many Germans still wore thin summer blouses and leather boots hardened by frost. To keep warm and lift morale, the German command began distributing alcohol, vodka or schnapps, 1 bottle per squad. Just like the Russian soldiers received their famous daily ration of 100 grams of vodka, the Germans, too, learned that a shot of strong liquor could briefly chase away the biting cold and lend false courage. But alcohol alone couldn't fill an empty stomach. Hunger persisted. So what did a German soldier actually eat during the Russian winter? Each division was assigned mobile field kitchens, nicknamed goulash cannons, Gulaschkanonen. These were horse-drawn wagons with boilers used for cooking soups, sauces, and porridge behind the lines. Ideally, every soldier was supposed to receive 1 hot meal a day, usually a thick soup or goulash with potatoes or pasta, plus bread and something for breakfast, a coffee substitute, a bit of butter or jam, and a cold supper such as sausage, cheese, or canned food. On paper, it didn't sound bad, but in reality, amid the frozen plains, those kitchens rarely reached the front. Supply columns got stuck in snow or mud. In November, roads turned into swamps. By December, they froze into rock-hard ice. Trucks and horse carts froze in place. Soviet partisans raided rear depots. Frontline soldiers often had to rely entirely on whatever remained in their haversacks, and that dwindled quickly. Imagine a group of German infantrymen in trenches near Moscow, January 1942. Snow up to their waists, the temperature around 30 degrees Celsius. A young rifleman pulls out his daily ration, a quarter loaf of bread, about 250 grams, meant to last the entire day. Now, in the evening, that bread is rock solid and completely frozen. He tries to bite into it, but risks breaking his teeth. Finally, he smashes the loaf with his rifle butt into small chunks. With the bread, he has a can of spread, perhaps Rubenzol's, a beetroot paste, or canned lard. But the can, too, is frozen stiff. He tucks it under his tunic, directly against his bare skin, trying to warm it with body heat. Meanwhile, his comrade attempts to light a small, solid fuel stove, one of the tiny alcohol burners distributed in emergencies. A single tablet of dry fuel might heat a mug of water for coffee, if the flame didn't blow out in the wind. While he waits for the drink to warm, the young rifleman gnaws at his frozen bread and cold lard. Such meals were not exceptions. They were routine. According to soldiers' letters, some Germans even chewed raw frozen bacon or smoked meat. They needed fat and protein, even if the food was tasteless. The lucky ones occasionally got hot soup from the field kitchen, but even that could turn tragic. The soup often froze on the way. Officers recorded how cooks had to serve meals right beside the cauldrons, because as soon as the boiling soup was ladled out, it solidified within minutes into a layer of ice. It literally happened that a soldier would raise his mess tin to his lips, and by then, the soup had already congealed into a cold porridge or even solid ice. Those who didn't eat quickly simply threw away frozen soup blocks. Men learned to gulp scalding hot soup to finish it before it froze. The same comic tragedy occurred with butter. It turned into a solid, waxy mass that couldn't be spread. One report stated that soldiers had to saw butter with a wood saw, since even a knife couldn't cut through it. If anyone still had jam, it crystallized into sugary ice. Calories were insufficient, and soldiers weakened. In freezing conditions, the human body burns far more energy. German doctors estimated that a man at 30 degrees Celsius needed 4,000–5,000 calories per day just to stay alive and maintain strength. In reality, many received barely half that. The result was malnutrition. Men felt dizzy when standing up. Their vision blurred. They became apathetic. Frostbite and hunger often led to a kind of passive resignation. A soldier with badly frozen feet no longer thought of battle, only of sitting down to rest. And when he sat down in the snow, he might never rise again. By the end of that winter, reports counted over 100,000 frostbite cases in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. More than 14,000 were so severe they required amputation. By spring, the number of frostbitten men exceeded 250,000. The frozen and starving army was collapsing, without the Soviets even needing to fire. German field reports described the desperate conditions vividly. Soldiers were said to have blown up frozen potato fields with grenades just to dig out hard, icy potatoes for food. Others hunted small animals in the forests. Whoever managed to shoot a rabbit or bird instantly became the hero of the day. But soon, even the wildlife disappeared. And then came the turn of the army's own horses, the only livestock left alive. The German army depended heavily on horses. Millions of them were used for transport. Once the supplies of oats and hay were gone, the animals began to starve and freeze to death. Many units tried to save themselves by slaughtering their horses for meat. Paradoxically, the dying horses ended up feeding their starving masters. Near Moscow in January 1942, one German infantryman recalled how his unit lost so many horses that the men survived for weeks eating nothing but horse meat. They cooked thick stews with bits of millet when they could find it, and roasted chunks of meat on bayonets over open fires. Another soldier cynically noted that the front was offering free beef, referring to the carcasses of dead Soviet cattle found along the roads. Indeed, even the frozen remains of livestock from abandoned collective farms became prey for the starving invaders. On the other side of the front, among Soviet soldiers, life was hardly easier, at least in the beginning. The Red Army had, since October 1941, introduced new daily food rations. Around 800–900 grams of bread, 150 grams of meat, 120 grams of grains, and 50 grams of sugar per soldier. On paper, that seemed fair, but reality lagged far behind. During the chaotic retreats of the summer of 1941, the Soviets lost enormous stockpiles. Warehouses burned, and fertile regions of Ukraine and southern Russia fell into German hands. As a result, even the defenders suffered severe supply crises. By the winter of 1941–42, many Soviet infantrymen near Moscow were in just as dire a condition as their enemies. The difference was that the Soviets had greater experience with winter hardships, and their leadership reacted more effectively. From the Far East came not only hardened Siberian divisions, but also millions of warm padded jackets, fur hats, and felt boots. And with warmth on the body, a person can survive on smaller food rations. Soviet command also prioritized hot meals for morale. Even under fire, field kitchens of the Red Army operated whenever possible. In darkness, at dawn, or after sunset, whenever smoke could be concealed, field cooks lit fires under their boilers. These mobile kitchens, called pochodnaya kuchnia, campaign kitchens, were often operated by women, uniformed female cooks. Whenever conditions allowed, they prepared hot meals twice a day, porridge or kasha in the morning, and thick soup or stewed potatoes with bits of meat in the evening. A typical dish was kulish, a porridge-like millet soup mixed with whatever ingredients were available. A slice of bacon, canned meat, onions, or dried vegetables. Traditional soups like borscht and shchi also appeared whenever possible. Veterans later recalled how uplifting it was to receive a single bowl of hot kasha or soup in a trench. It felt as though the frost itself retreated for a moment, warming the body from within and giving new strength to fight. Still, even Soviet rations could be painfully meager. When supplies ran low, bread portions were cut drastically. During the siege of Leningrad, 1941–42, the civilian ration dropped to a horrific 125 grams of bread per day. Soldiers received more, around 500 grams, but even that barely covered the body's needs in sub-zero temperatures. In besieged Leningrad, soldiers shared their rations with civilians, and military bakers improvised to stretch every resource. Bread dough was mixed with substitutes, dried carrots, beet peels, even wood cellulose. The result was the infamous blockade bread, dark, rubbery, bitter, and containing only a fraction of real flour. Yet that bread saved thousands of lives, mostly among civilians. Frontline soldiers were luckier. They usually received bread from field bakeries positioned near the front. As the war dragged on, ingredients grew scarcer, and Soviet cooks invented new substitutes. There was carrot tea, made by boiling grated carrots with pieces of chaga fungus to create a dark, sweetish brew. Instead of coffee, they drank roasted barley decoctions. Some even baked bread from mashed boiled potatoes mixed with bran and salt, especially in the Rations region. The taste was far from pleasant, but it kept people alive. On both sides, the first wartime winter revealed a grim truth. No army is stronger than its stomach. The Germans learned, to their horror, that they had underestimated the need for winter supplies. The Soviets learned that even vast agricultural reserves could vanish within months of war. But the trial of frost was far from over. The following winters brought new horrors, and the worst hunger of all came during the winter of 1942-43, on the banks of the Volga, in the ruins of a city that became a symbol of human endurance, Stalingrad. I have nothing good left to tell you about myself. For a long time now, we haven't received any meat or fat. I can think only of food. At night, hunger keeps me awake. My stomach twists in pain. A few days ago, 2 dogs ran past. I shot one, but it was horribly thin. Those lines were written in September 1942 by a German soldier besieged near Stalingrad, in a letter that never reached its recipient. It was later found among the wreckage of a downed aircraft attempting to deliver mail out of the encirclement. It spoke volumes about the merciless hunger tormenting soldiers even at the very start of the Battle of Stalingrad. And winter hadn't even arrived yet. The Battle of Stalingrad, summer 1942, February 1943, marked a turning point in the war, and one of humanity's most tragic ordeals. By the fall of 1942, the situation for General Paulus's German Sixth Army worsened daily. On November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, their encirclement maneuver. Within days, the pincers closed around the city, trapping about 290,000 German and Axis soldiers, including Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian units, along with several thousand civilians, wounded men in field hospitals, and local Russians who had survived the street fighting. Suddenly, all of them were cut off from regular supplies. The siege began. The brutal winter followed. December 1942 and January 1943 brought temperatures around 25°C, alternating between blizzards and clear, deadly frosts. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, people starved in ways that are almost beyond imagination. The German command had promised that the Sixth Army would be supplied by air. Every day, several dozen transport planes were to deliver ammunition, medicine, fuel, and food. But the Luftwaffe failed. Soviet anti-aircraft guns dominated the skies. Weather made flying impossible for days. And even when planes succeeded, they could carry far too little. The army needed 500 tons of supplies per day to survive. Often, it received barely 100 tons, sometimes less. And even that went mostly to ammunition and fuel. Food became an afterthought. At first, in November, there were still warehouses full of supplies, but tens of thousands of hungry mouths emptied them fast. By December, rations were cut to the bare minimum. A daily bread ration of 200 grams per person, soon reduced even further. 200 grams, a few thin slices of bread, was all a soldier got. For a man working, freezing, and fighting, it was pitifully little. And even that bread was made from emergency mixtures of grains and corn, sometimes diluted with barley or sawdust flour. Field bakeries kept baking until the very end. But by January, the grain was gone. Meat, at first, came mainly from canned reserves. Each German unit had an emergency supply known as the Eiserne portion, the iron ration, which included tinned beef, bully beef, similar to modern canned stew. But once the encirclement began, these iron rations were quickly eaten. Then the soldiers turned to the only available source of meat once again: horses. In December, the Sixth Army still possessed around 10,000 horses in transport and artillery units. But as ammunition ran out and fodder disappeared, they began dying en masse from starvation and cold. The survivors were slaughtered by order of the officers and divided among the troops. Men cooked horsemeat soups, stews, or the so-called Eintopf, a one-pot meal of whatever ingredients remained. They ate horsemeat boiled, roasted, even raw and frozen. Officers tried to maintain a semblance of normality. On Christmas Eve 1942, several units reportedly served goulash that was supposed to be beef, but everyone knew it came from their own dead horses. Another regiment recorded that for New Year's Eve they cooked a festive pilaf from horsemeat and millet. Of course, it was more an act of desperation than celebration. Despite the hunger, soldiers sometimes tried to preserve black humor. Letters and diaries from the Stalingrad pocket contain grim jokes. One soldier wrote, "On the first holiday we had goose with rice. On the second day, goose with peas. For weeks now, we've had nothing but goose. Only our geese have 4 legs and wear horseshoes." Everyone understood the joke. They called horsemeat goose to make it sound less dreadful. The same letter added that the taste was terrible, but pretending to feast gave them the illusion of morale. Yet even the horses could not feed them forever. By mid-January 1943, no living animals remained. Everything edible had been consumed. The soldiers then turned to boiling hides and bones. Captured German survivors later testified that men cut strips of leather from horse carcasses and boiled them in water to produce a gelatinous broth. Some even tried roasting horse hooves, just as starving civilians had done during the siege of Leningrad. When the hides were gone, they turned to dogs and cats. The ruins of Stalingrad were full of starving strays that had survived the bombing. Thin, trembling dogs and cats scavenged like humans for anything to eat. For desperate soldiers, those 4-legged companions eventually became prey. Many dogs were shot and eaten. In the same letter quoted earlier, the soldier lamented that the dog he had shot was too thin to provide much meat. That showed how dire the situation had become. Animals and men were both skeletons. The condition of the soldiers worsened rapidly. Many suffered from severe malnutrition and hunger-related diseases. Scurvy appeared due to a lack of vitamin C, dysentery spread from spoiled food, and overall immunity collapsed. Men died of infections that, under normal circumstances, would have been harmless. A simple cold or pneumonia combined with starvation killed hundreds daily. Some soldiers suddenly collapsed without a shot fired. They would stand guard one moment, and the next, fall dead where they stood. One notorious episode revealed the tragic irony of desperation. Late in 1942, when German command realized how catastrophically short on calories the troops were, they decided to send into Stalingrad a new superfood, a concentrated meat paste packed in tins. It was meant to give a starving soldier hours of energy. But the effect was deadly. The half-starved bodies could no longer digest such rich fat content. Soon after eating it, men began dying mysteriously, collapsing suddenly with no visible cause. Doctors inside the pocket discovered the reason: liver and pancreatic failure. After weeks of starvation, the human body could not handle the sudden flood of fats. The improved rations were immediately withdrawn, but for many, it was too late. This tragic episode showed just how extreme the situation in Stalingrad had become. Even attempts to help ended up killing the men they were meant to save. By January 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army were compressed into a handful of ruined sectors. Cooking had long ceased. There was almost no food left. Those few who still had supplies guarded them with weapons in hand. Then came acts of despair beyond comprehension. There are hints, never officially confirmed, that some isolated soldiers may have resorted to cannibalism in the final days. Unlike the civilian cases documented during the siege of Leningrad, German cannibalism in Stalingrad was never proven. Yet Soviet investigators later claimed that in several cellars they found remains suggesting such horror. Whether true or not, hunger had reached its absolute extreme. On February 3, 1943, the last surviving German units surrendered. The Red Army entered the ruins to find human wrecks, men reduced to walking skeletons. Many prisoners weighed 1/3 less than when they had entered Stalingrad. A Soviet officer later recalled discovering skeleton-thin soldiers who were still alive, men so weak they could not lift their arms. Field hospitals were filled with wounded soldiers slowly dying of starvation. Ironically, the rations for the wounded had been the smallest of all. The unproductive mouths were given the least priority. Soviet medics immediately offered the prisoners warm, watery soup and dried bread. The famished men devoured it so fiercely that the medics had to restrain them. Sudden overeating could kill. Indeed, this refeeding syndrome claimed additional lives, so the victors had to feed their enemies cautiously, spoon by spoon. The frozen, starving inferno of Stalingrad entered history as a terrible warning. Never before or since had so many soldiers endured such extremes in so short a time. Of the original 290,000 encircled, only about 5,000, 6,000 eventually survived captivity. Most perished in combat, from wounds or from hunger and frost on the way to POW camps. Hunger killed more men than bullets, and not only Germans. Civilians in Stalingrad also suffered and died of starvation. On the Soviet side, too, defenders of the city starved, eating horses and even cats. Their heroism was measured not only in resistance but in endurance. Many survived on nothing more than a handful of millet a day. After Stalingrad, both sides learned a brutal lesson. Logistics of food meant survival. From the spring of 1943 onward, the Soviets built stronger supply routes, added more field kitchens, and began receiving Allied aid. The Germans, meanwhile, would never again attempt such a grand winter offensive. Even after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the frost and hunger continued to torment the armies on the Eastern Front. The following winters brought new suffering, especially for the retreating Axis forces. In the winter of 1943-44, many German soldiers once again faced encirclement and starvation. One of the most tragic episodes was the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky Pocket, sometimes called the Little Stalingrad on the Dnieper. There, on the Ukrainian steppe, tens of thousands of German troops were surrounded by Soviet forces amid snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures. Once again, they found themselves cut off, relying only on air-dropped supplies, and once again, they ate their horses. Veterans later recalled how the soldiers boiled horse meat soup with millet when they were lucky enough to find some grains. Others simply roasted thin slices of frozen meat over small fires, using rifle bayonets as skewers. When even that food ran out, they ground up horse fodder grain, soaked it in water, and called it a delicacy compared to nothing. German survivors of Korsun remembered that they had eaten everything edible that once breathed. Starvation was so severe that when the breakout attempt came, thousands were too weak to march and froze in the snow. At the same time, Italian units on the Eastern Front suffered their own frozen catastrophe. In January 1943, parallel to Stalingrad, tens of thousands of Italians from the Armir, the Italian army in Russia, retreated in chaos from the River Don. They trudged for days through blizzards without food, Italian officers desperately searched abandoned villages for provisions. Veterans later admitted they had to steal food from civilians just to stay alive. Sacks of potatoes, beets, jars of pickles, even live chickens. For the locals, it was a tragedy. For the soldiers, a matter of survival. The Italian troops were completely unequipped for winter. Many wore thin uniforms and summer boots. Thousands died from exhaustion and hunger during the retreat, an event remembered in Italy as La Morte Bianca, the White Death. Some survivors later said they lived only thanks to miraculous coincidences, finding an abandoned barrel of sauerkraut or stumbling upon a dead horse, yielding a few kilograms of meat. As the war turned in favor of the Soviets, the pattern repeated. The Red Army advanced, and the Germans retreated, but the cold and hunger struck both. Even during Soviet offensives, logistics often lagged behind the front. Transport columns bogged down in snow, supplies froze, and soldiers at the vanguard again found themselves rationed to crumbs. Still, the Soviets were learning fast. By late 1943, they had organized better field kitchens, more efficient food depots, and improved rail delivery systems. On the Western Front, meanwhile, a new winter brought its own frozen battle. The Ardennes offensive, the last desperate strike of the Third Reich. It was there that American and British troops would face the same enemy that had haunted the Eastern Front for years: the cold. By the end of 1944, it seemed the Nazi regime was collapsing. Allied armies were advancing across France and liberating Belgium. But in December, Hitler struck one last time: the surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The forested hills along the Belgian-Luxembourg border became the scene of a desperate winter battle, known as the Battle of the Bulge. And as if war itself weren't enough, that December turned out to be one of the coldest European winters in years. Temperatures plunged deep below freezing. Snow fell by day, ice glazed the forests by night. American soldiers, who suddenly found themselves under furious German attack, suffered not only from bullets, but from frost, nearly as cruel as that which had ravaged the Eastern Front. The worst hit were men of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in the small Belgian town of Bastogne. It became a miniature Stalingrad of the West, encircled soldiers, dwindling supplies, and Arctic weather. The Americans, however, had one advantage. Their encirclement lasted only about a week, and they held limited air superiority. When weather allowed, planes dropped parachutes loaded with food and ammunition. Yet during the first days, the men were cut off, with almost no food. What did the Americans eat in those freezing forests? The U.S. Army had entered the war equipped with several kinds of rations: the K ration, individual daily meal packs, and the C ration, canned food designed for field use. In Bastogne, soldiers survived mostly on a mix of both. A K ration contained a few hard crackers, a bar of chocolate, a small tin of cheese or luncheon meat, similar to Spam, instant coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. The C rations were larger cans, beans with pork, stewed beef, or goulash, meant to be heated over fire. But there was a problem. In the snowy woods of Bastogne, lighting a fire was deadly dangerous. Dry wood was scarce, and smoke drew German artillery. The enemy often shelled any place where a thin column of smoke appeared. So many paratroopers ate their rations cold. Cans of pork and beans turned into solid fat blocks, which had to be pried out with a knife. Beans became icy marbles floating in lard. Some soldiers improvised. They sat on their cans or tucked them under their jackets to soften the contents with body heat. One paratrooper recalled, "On Christmas Eve, we toasted with cold beans straight from the can. That was our holiday feast. Others chewed on hard candies or gum from the rations. Anything to trick the stomach into feeling full. For warmth, they made instant coffee by pouring the powder straight into their mouths and washing it down with snow or icy water, since boiling water was impossible. The bitter, cold brew tasted awful, but the caffeine worked. Yet even in that frozen siege, there were moments of human kindness and warmth. One famous story tells of an American soldier who shared his last piece of chocolate with a captured German on Christmas Eve. In another, local Belgian civilians showed compassion despite their own hunger. Many families hid in basements, trembling from cold and shell fire. But some still shared what little they had. Veteran Keith Davis of the 101st Airborne recalled, "We were on the edge of Bastogne when we found a farmhouse. Inside were a man, a woman, and 2 children. The woman gave us soup and dark bread. We stayed the night. Outside, the war raged, yet that house, by some miracle, wasn't hit. It was Christmas Eve. We sang Silent Night with that Belgian family. Different words, same melody. I'll never forget it." He later said it was the best meal of his life, a simple bowl of vegetable soup and a slice of bread, but it meant peace. A few days later, relief finally arrived. On December 26th, American tanks broke through to Bastogne, bringing the first fresh supplies. Planes followed, dropping parachutes full of food, K-rations, chocolate, and canned goods. The joy of the soldiers was indescribable. They threw themselves at the supply crates, laughing and crying as they opened boxes of food, and even mail from home. Some unwrapped belated Christmas packages, pies, cookies, or small gifts from mothers and wives. One paratrooper joked, "You're lucky you got socks instead of strudel. I'd have eaten that in a second." From that experience, the U.S. Army learned a vital lesson. In winter, morale depends on hot food. After the Ardennes, commanders made sure every division had field kitchens wherever possible. Even during battle, soldiers brewed hot chicken soup whenever they could. Private Malcolm Buck, from the 3rd Armored Division, later told of standing watch in snowdrifts when an elderly Belgian woman appeared with 2 steaming cups of chicken broth for him and his buddy. "It was the best meal of my life," he recalled. And this from a man raised in Alabama, the land of barbecue and cornbread. 1 cup of hot soup at the right moment was worth all the steaks in the world, because it meant survival. While the Americans fought through the snow of the Ardennes, their British and Canadian allies endured their own brutal winter on the Western Front, in the Netherlands and Western Germany during 1944-45. The winter was harsh, the cold relentless, and supply lines often stretched thin across flooded fields and bombed-out roads. Still, the British Army was famous for one thing: discipline, routine, and tea. A British soldier's daily ration was, on paper, more generous than that of most armies. It included canned bacon, biscuits, tea, sugar, powdered milk, and, for the cold, rum. The rum ration was a long-standing naval and military tradition. A small tot of rum in the morning or at night was believed to warm the body and lift morale. In reality, alcohol constricts blood vessels and cools the body faster, but psychologically, it gave men courage and comfort. During the Christmas of 1944, British troops on the front received small luxuries from their commanders: canned Christmas puddings, a few extra cigarettes, and, of course, a double rum ration. It didn't erase the cold or danger, but for a moment it brought back a sense of home. Canadian soldiers in the Netherlands faced similar conditions: icy rain, flooded trenches, and freezing mud. Reports spoke of countless cases of frostbite and trench foot, a painful condition caused by cold and damp, where the feet swelled, blistered, and sometimes rotted. Warm meals couldn't cure it, but they could at least prevent total exhaustion. The British and Canadians maintained their spirits through tea breaks, a ritual that survived even under artillery fire. Veterans recalled how, no matter the situation, someone always managed to light a small burner and brew a pot of strong tea with milk, and sometimes a dash of rum. This simple act provided a moment of humanity and warmth in the midst of chaos. One British corporal wrote in his diary, "We were shelled all morning, and it rained without end. But after lunch, the sergeant boiled tea. I held that mug in my frozen hands, and for a few minutes, the war disappeared." Meanwhile, the 10th U.S. Mountain Division fought its own frozen battles high in the Apennine Mountains of Italy at the turn of 1944-45. There, American troops climbed snowy ridges where temperatures fell below 20 degrees C. Their supply lines were so strained that everything, food, fuel, ammunition, had to be carried on mules or on their own backs. To meet those conditions, the U.S. Army developed special mountain rations. Light, compact food with high energy content. Chocolate bars, dried meat, nuts, powdered milk, and sugar cubes. There was even a 5-in-1 mountain menu, a box designed to feed 5 men for one day. It contained soup powder, pea or potato, fruit preserves, biscuits, and instant coffee. These dehydrated foods had one major advantage. They didn't freeze solid. Dried ingredients remained usable even in the coldest weather. Soldiers could quickly prepare hot soup or chocolate when they managed to melt snow for water. Veterans recalled mornings when they warmed themselves with a mug of instant pea soup, and evenings when they drank hot cocoa while camping in icy valleys. Sometimes, when no fire could be lit, they made chocolate snow, mixing snow with cocoa powder and sugar straight from the rations, turning necessity into grim humor. Even more extreme were the conditions faced by American and Canadian troops on the Aleutian Islands near Alaska in 1943, fighting the Japanese. The islands of Kiska and Attu had a subarctic climate, freezing winds, blizzards, and dense fog. There, soldiers learned that sometimes their weapons were easier to warm than their food. Reports told how the barrels of M1 Garand rifles became so hot from firing that men held their frozen hands to them to thaw their fingers, or used the warm metal to heat cans of food. Some joked that after long firefights, they would lick melted snow from the rifle barrel, their improvised hot drink. Those Arctic lessons later inspired the development of special cold weather rations after the war. The horrors of winter hunger during the Second World War left a lasting mark on military thinking. After 1945, generals and planners asked the same urgent question: how can we make sure that soldiers never again starve or freeze like those at Stalingrad or Bastogne? One direct consequence was the revolution in military field rations. Armies around the world began designing food specifically for extreme conditions: light, compact, nutritious, and resistant to freezing. In the 1950s, the U.S. Army developed special Arctic rations, precursors of what we now know as MREs, meals ready to eat. These new rations consisted of dehydrated foods that could be reconstituted with hot water. The advantages were obvious. They didn't freeze solid, they didn't spoil in the cold, and they contained very high energy in a small volume. A modern soldier could carry several days' worth of food without fear that it would turn into a block of ice. It was also learned that soldiers in sub-zero temperatures need far more calories than in moderate climates, up to 4,500 calories a day, compared to the usual 3,000. Modern cold-weather rations therefore include more fats and carbohydrates, but balanced carefully to avoid overloading the body. A lesson painfully learned at Stalingrad, where overrich food had killed the starving. Vitamin supplements also became standard, especially vitamin C to prevent scurvy, along with sufficient salt and minerals, since sweating in heavy winter gear can silently drain the body's reserves. Logistics of hot food were also completely reimagined. New field stoves, wind-shielded burners, and chemical heaters made it possible to eat warm meals even in blizzards. Modern MREs often contain a self-heating pouch. You place the entree inside, add a bit of water, and a chemical reaction produces heat, warming the food without flame or smoke. Such technology would have seemed like a miracle to the soldiers freezing outside Leningrad or Bastogne. In addition, modern armies now train their troops extensively in cold-weather survival. NATO soldiers learn how to build snow shelters, start fires in freezing wind, melt snow for drinking water, and even warm canned food on vehicle engines. Skills that soldiers once learned the hard way, through death and suffering, are now practiced in safety during training. The history of wartime winter food also had cultural consequences. The most famous example, the canned meat Spam. This simple mixture of pork and ham became legendary precisely because of World War II. The United States supplied it not only to its own troops, but also to its allies, especially the British and the Soviets. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev later said, "Without Spam, we would not have been able to feed our army. We lost our most fertile lands." That single statement shows how vital those Western food shipments were for the USSR when its agriculture was devastated by war. Soviet soldiers loved Spam so much, they jokingly called it the Second Front. While the real Second Front, the Allied invasion of Europe, was still months away, the American cans were already fighting hunger. After the war, Spam and similar canned products spread among civilians, influencing post-war cuisine and even popular culture. People had learned the value of non-perishable, long-lasting food in times of crisis. Today's soldiers no longer face starvation, as their grandfathers did in the 1940s. Modern logistics are astonishingly efficient, yet the old truth remains. Extreme cold and hunger are still among the toughest enemies any army can face. Even in modern conflicts, in the mountains of Afghanistan or the Arctic training grounds of Scandinavia, armies must still ensure that food does not freeze, that energy bars stay soft near the body, and that snow is melted for water to prevent hidden dehydration. For those of us sitting in warm homes, brewing tea beside full refrigerators, the winter stories of World War II soldiers remain deeply humbling. They remind us that beyond tactics and weapons, victory often depended on something as simple as a bowl of soup or a slice of bread. A hot meal could lift morale, restore hope, and sometimes, literally, mean survival. And so, when we see a field kitchen in a museum or taste a military ration at a reenactment, we remember the countless unnamed cooks and soldiers who fed others so they might live another day. Every bowl of soup was a small victory over winter. Every shared crust of bread was proof of solidarity stronger than frost. The war eventually ended, but its lessons about hunger, endurance, and humanity endure forever.